Chapter 73 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daisy55. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 73. How to Get Out of Chancery. Things at this time so befell me that I cannot tell one half, but am like a boy who has left his lesson to the master's very footfall, unready except with false excuses. And as this makes no good work, so I lament upon my lingering in the times when I might have got through a good page, but went astray after trifles. However, every man must do according to his intellect, and looking at the easy manner of my constitution, I think that most men will regard me with pity and goodwill for trying, more than with contempt and wrath for having tried unworthily. Even as in the wrestling ring, whatever man did his best, and made an honest conflict, I always laid him down with softness, easing off his dusty fall. But the thing which next betided me was not a fall of any sort, but rather a most glorious rise to the summit of all fortune. For in good truth it was no less than the return of Lorna, my own darling, in wonderful health and spirits, and as glad as a bird to get back again. It would have done any one good for a 12-month to behold her face in Doones, and her beaming eyes and smile, not to mention blushes also at my salutation, when this queen of every heart ran about our rooms again. She did love this, and she must see that, and where was our old friend the cat? All the house was full of brightness, as if the sun had come over the hill, and Lorna were his mirror. My mother sat in an ancient chair and wiped her cheeks, and looked at her, and even Lizzie's eyes must dance to the freshness and joy of her beauty. As for me, you might call me mad, for I ran out and flung my best hat in the barn, and kissed Mother Fry, till she made at me with the sugar nippers. What a quantity of things Lorna had to tell us, and yet how often we stopped her mouth, at least Mother, and Lizzie, and she quite as often would stop her own, running up in her joy to some one of us. And then there arose the eating business, which people now call refreshments, in these dandy-field days of our language. For how was it possible that our Lorna could have come all that way, and to her own Exmoor, without being terribly hungry? "Oh, I do love it all so much," said Lorna, now for the 50th time, and not meaning only the victuals. "The scent of the goose on the moors drove me wild, and the primroses under the hedges. I am sure I was meant for a farmer's, for a farmhouse life, dear Lizzie." For Lizzie was looking saucily, just as you were meant for a soldier's bride, and for writing dispatches of victory. And now, since you will not ask me, dear mother, in the excellence of your manners, and even John has not the impudence, in spite of all his coats of arms, I must tell you a thing, which I vowed to keep until tomorrow morning. But my resolution fails me. I am my own mistress. What think you of that, mother? I am my own mistress. "Then you shall not be so long," cried I, for mother seemed not to understand her, and sought about for her glasses. "Darling, you shall be mistress of me, and I will be your master." A frank announcement of your intent, and beyond doubt a true one, but surely unusual at this stage, and a little premature, John. However, what must be, must be. And with tears springing out of smiles, she fell on my breast and cried a lot. When I came to smoke a pipe over it, after the rest were gone to bed, I could hardly believe in my good luck, For here was I, without any merit, except of bodily power, and the absence of any falsehood, which surely is no condemnation, so placed that the noblest man in England might envy me, and be vexed with me. For the noblest lady in all the land, and the purest, and the sweetest, hung upon my heart, as if there was none to equal it. I dwelt upon this matter long and very severely, while I smoked a new tobacco brought by my own Lorna for me, and next to herself most delicious. And as the smoke curled away, I thought, surely this is too fine to last, for a man who never deserved it. Seeing no way out of this, I resolved to place my faith in God, and so went to bed and dreamed of it, and having no presence of mind to pray for anything under the circumstances, I thought it best to fall asleep, and trust myself to the future. Yet ere I fell asleep, the roof above me swarmed with angels, having Lorna under it. In the morning, Lorna was ready to tell her story, and we to hearken, and she wore a dress of most simple stuff, and yet perfectly wonderful by means of the shape and her figure. Lizzie was wild with jealousy, as might be expected, though never would Annie have been so, but have praised it and craved for the pattern. And mother, not understanding it, looked forth to be taught about it. For it was strange to note that lately my dear mother had lost her quickness, and was never quite brisk, unless the question were about myself. She had seen a great deal of trouble, and grief begins to close on people as their power of life declines. We said that she was hard of hearing, but my opinion was that seeing me inclined for marriage made her think of my father, and so perhaps a little too much, to dwell on the courting of 30 years agone. Anyhow, she was the very best of mothers, and would smile and command herself, and be, or try to believe myself, as happy as could be in the doings of the younger folk, and her own skill in detecting them, yet with the wisdom of age, renouncing any opinion upon the matter, since none could see the end of it. But Lorna, in her bright young beauty, and her knowledge of my heart, was not to be checked by any thoughts of haply coming evil. In the morning she was up, even sooner than I was, and through all the corners of the hens, remembering every one of them. I caught her, and saluted her with such warmth, being now none to look at us, that she vowed she would never come out again, and yet she came the next morning. These things ought not to be chronicled, yet I am of such nature that, finding many parts of life adverse to our wishes, I must now and then draw pleasure from the blessed portions. And what portion can be more blessed than with youth and health and strength, to be loved by a virtuous maid, and to love her with all one's heart? Neither was my pride diminished when I found what she had done, only from her love of me. Earl Brandir's ancient steward, in whose charge she had travelled with a proper escort, looked upon her as a lovely maniac, and the mixture of pity and admiration wherewith he regarded her was a strange thing to observe, especially after he had seen our simple house and manners. On the other hand, Lorna considered him a worthy but foolish old gentleman, to whom true happiness meant no more than money and high position. These two last she had been ready to abandon wholly, and had in part escaped from them, as the enemies of her happiness, and she took advantage of the times in a truly clever manner. For that happened to be a time, as indeed all times heretofore, so far as my knowledge extends, have, somehow or other, happened to be, when everybody was only too glad to take money for doing anything. And the greatest money taker in the kingdom, next to the king and queen of course, who had due preeminence and had taught the maids of honor, was generally acknowledged to be the Lord Chief Justice Jeffreys. Upon his return from the bloody Aziz with triumph and great glory, after hanging every man who was too poor to help it, he pleased his gracious majesty so purely with the description of their delightful agonies, that the king exclaimed, "This man alone is worthy to be at the head of the law." Accordingly, in his hand was placed the great seal of England. So it came to pass that Lorna's destiny hung upon Lord Jeffreys, for at this time Earl Brandir died, being taken with gout in the heart, soon after I left London. Lorna was very sorry for him, but as he had never been able to hear one tone of her sweet silvery voice, it is not to be supposed that she wept without consolation. She grieved for him as we ought to grieve for any good man going, and yet with a comforting sense of the benefit which the blessed exchange must bring to him. Now the Lady Lorna Doone appeared to Lord Chancellor Jeffreys so exceeding wealthy a ward that the lock would pay for turning. Therefore he came of his own accord to visit her and to treat with her, having heard, for the man was as big a gossip as never cared for anybody, yet loved to know all about everybody, that this wealthy and beautiful maiden would not listen to any young lord, having pledged her faith to the plain John Ridd. Thereupon our Lorna managed so to hold out golden hopes to the Lord High Chancellor, that he, being not more than 3 parts drunk, saw his way to a heap of money, and there and then, for he was not the man to daily long about anything, upon surety of a certain round sum, the amount of which I will not mention, because of his kindness towards me, he gave to his fair ward permission, under sign and seal, to marry that loyal knight John Ridd, upon condition only that the king's consent should be obtained. His Majesty's well disposed towards me for my previous service, and regarding me as a good Catholic, being moved moreover by the Queen, who desired to please Lorna, consented, without much hesitation, upon the understanding that Lorna, when she became of full age, and the mistress of her property, which was still under guardianship, should pay a heavy fine to the crown, and devote a fixed portion of her estate to the promotion of the holy Catholic faith, in a manner to be dictated by the king himself. Inasmuch, however, as King James was driven out of his kingdom before this arrangement could take effect, and another king succeeded, who desired not the promotion of the Catholic religion, neither hankered after subsidies, whether French or English, that agreement was pronounced invalid, improper, and contemptible. However, there was no getting back the money once paid to Lord Chancellor Jeffreys. But what thought we of money at this present moment, or of position, or anything else, except indeed one another? Lorna told me, with the sweetest smile, that if I were minded to take her at all, I must take her without anything, inasmuch as she meant, upon coming of age, to make over the residue of her estates to the next of kin, as being unfit for a farmer's wife. And I replied, with the greatest warmth and a readiness to worship her, that this was exactly what I longed for, but had never dared to propose it. But dear mother looked most exceedingly grave, and said that, to be sure, her opinion could not be expected to count for much, but she really hoped that in 3 years' time we should both be a little wiser, and have more regard for our interests, and perhaps those of others, by that time. And Master Snow, having daughters only, and nobody coming to marry them, if anything happened to the good old man, and who could tell in 3 years' time what might happen to all or any of us, why perhaps his farm would be for sale, and perhaps Lady Lorna's estates in Scotland would fetch enough money to buy it, and so throw the 2 farms into one, and save all the trouble about the brook, as my poor father had longed to do many and many a time, but not having a title could not do all quite as he wanted. And then if we young people grew tired of the old mother, as seemed only too likely, and was according to nature, why we could send her over there and Lizzie to keep her company. When mother had finished and wiped her eyes, Lorna, who had been blushing rosily at some portions of this great speech, flung her fair arms around mother's neck, and kissed her very heartily, and scolded her, as she well deserved, for her want of confidence in us. My mother replied that if anybody could deserve her John, it was Lorna, but that she could not hold with the rashness of giving up money so easily, while her next of kin would be John himself, and who could tell what others by the time she was 21. Hereupon I felt that after all my mother had common sense on her side, for if Master Snow's farm should be for sale, it would be far more to the purpose than my coat of arms, to get it, for there was a different pasture there, just suited for change of diet to our sheep as well as large cattle. And besides this, even with all Annie's skills, and of course yet more now she was gone, their butter would always command in the market from 1 to 3 farthings a pound more than we could get for ours. And few things vexed us more than this. Whereas, if we got possession of the farm, we might, without breach of the market laws, or any harm done to any one, the price being but a prejudice, sell all our butter as snow butter, and do good to all our customers. Thinking thus, yet remembering that Farmer Nicholas might hold out for another score of years, as I heartily hoped he might, or that one, if not all, of his comely daughters might marry a good young farmer, or farmers, if the case were so, or that, even without that, the farm might never be put up for sale, I begged my Lorna to do as she liked, or rather to wait and think of it, for as yet she could do nothing. End of chapter 73. Recording by Daisy 55. 74 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daisy 55. Lorna Doone by Aura D. Blackmore. Chapter 74. Driven Beyond Endurance. Also known as Blood upon the Altar in other editions. Everything was settled smoothly, and without any fear or fuss, that Lorna might find end of troubles, and myself of eager waiting, with the help of Parson Bowden, and the good wishes of 2 counties. I could scarce believe my fortune when I looked upon her beauty, gentleness, and sweetness, mingled with enough of humour and warm woman's feelings, never to be dull or tiring, never themselves to be weary. For she might be called a woman now, although a very young one, and as full of playful ways, or perhaps I may say 10 times as full, as if she had known no trouble. To wit, the spirit of bright childhood, having been so curbed and straitened, ere its time was over, now broke forth, enriched and varied with the garb of conscious maidenhood, and the sense of steadfast love, and eager love enfolding her, coloured with so many tingles all her locks, and words, and thoughts, that to me it was the noblest vision ever to think about her. But this was far too bright to last, without bitter break, and the plunging of happiness in horror, and of passionate joy in agony. My darling in her softest moments, when she was alone with me, when the spark of defiant eyes was veiled between dark lashes, and the challenge of gay beauty passed into sweetest invitation, at such times of her purest loved, and warmest faith in me, a deep abiding fear would flutter in her bounding heart as of deadly fate's approach. She would cling to me and nestle to me, being scarce of coyness, and lay one arm around my neck, and ask if I could do without her. Hence, as all emotions happily, of those who are more to us than ourselves, find within us stronger echo and more perfect answer, so I could not be regardless of some hidden evil, and my dark misgivings deepened as the time drew nearer. I kept a steadfast watch on Lorna, neglecting a field of beans entirely, as well as a litter of young pigs, and a cow somewhat given to jaundice, and I let Jim Slocum go to sleep in the toilet all one afternoon, and Bill Dadds draw off a bucket of cider, without so much as a "by your leave." For these men knew that my knighthood and my coat of arms, and most of all my love, were greatly against good farming, the sense of our country being, and perhaps it may be sensible, that a man who sticks up to be anything must allow himself to be cheated. But I never did stick up, nor would, though all the parish bade me, and I whistled the same tunes to my horses, and held my plough tree, just the same as if no king nor queen had ever come to spoil my tune or hand. For this thing nearly all the men around our parts upbraided me, but the women praised me, and for the most part these are right, when themselves are not concerned. However humble I might be, no one knowing anything of our part of the country would for a moment doubt that now here was a great to do, and talk of John Ridd and his wedding, the fierce fight with the Doones so lately, and my leading of the combat, though I fought not more than need be, and the vanishing of Sir Counsellor, and the galloping madness of Carver, and the religious fear of the women that this last was gone to hell. For he himself had declared that his aim, while he cut through the yeomanry, also their remorse, that he should have been made to go thither with all his children left behind. These things, I say, if ever I can again contrive to say anything, had led to the broadest excitement about my wedding of Lorna. We heard that people meant to come from more than 30 miles around, upon excuse of seeing my statue and Lorna's beauty, but in good truth out of sheer curiosity and the love of knitting. Our clerk had given notice that not a man should come inside the door of his church without shilling fee, and women, as sure as see twice as much, must every one pay 2 shillings. I thought this wrong, and as churchwarden begged that the money might be paid into my own hands, when taken. But the clerk said that was against all law, and he had orders from the parson to pay it to him without any delay. So as I always obey the parson, when I care not much about a thing, I let them have it their own way, though feeling inclined to believe sometimes that I ought to have some of the money. Dear mother arranged all the ins and outs of the way in which it was to be done, and Annie and Lizzie, and all the Snows, and even Ruth Huckaback, who was there after great profusion, made such a sweeping of dresses, that I scarcely knew where to place my feet, and longed for a staff to put by their gowns. Then Lorna came out of a pew half-way, in a manner which quite astonished me, and took my left hand in her right, and I prayed God that it were done with. My darling looked so glorious, that I was afraid of glancing at her, yet took in all her beauty. She was in a fright, no doubt, but nobody should see it, whereas I said, to myself at least, I will go through it like a grave digger. Lorna's dress was a pure white, clouded with faint lavender, for the sake of the old Earl Bender, and as simple as need be, Except for perfect loveliness, I was afraid to look at her, as I said before, except when each of us said, "I will," and then each dwelled upon the other. It is impossible for any who have not loved as I have to conceive my joy and pride, when after ring and all was gone and done, and the parson had blessed us, Lorna turned to look at me with her glances of subtle fun subdued by this great act. Her eyes, which none on earth may ever equal or compare with, told me such a depth of comfort, yet awaiting further commune, that I was almost amazed, thoroughly as I knew them. Darling eyes, the sweetest eyes, the loveliest, the most loving eyes. The sound of a shot ran through the church, and those eyes were filled with death. Lorna fell across my knee, when I was going to kiss her, as the bridegroom is allowed to, and encouraged, if he needs it. A flood of blood came out upon the yellow wood of the altar steps, and at my feet lay Lorna, trying to tell me some last message out of her faithful eyes. I lifted her up, and petted her, and coaxed her, but it was no good. The only sign of life remaining was a spirt of bright red blood. Some men know what things befall them in the supreme time of their life, far above the time of death; but to me comes back as a hazy dream, without any knowledge of it, what I did, or felt, or thought, with my wife's arms flagging around my neck, as I raised her up, and softly put them there. She sighed a long sigh on my breast, for her last farewell to life; and then she grew so cold, that I asked the time of year. It was Whit Tuesday, and the lilacs all in blossom; and why I thought of the time of year, and the young death in my arms, God or His angels may decide, having so strangely given us enough that so I did, and looked, and our white lilacs were beautiful. Then I laid my wife in my mother's arms, and begging that no one would make a noise, went forth for my revenge. Of course I knew I had done it. I knew who did it. There was but one man in the world, or at any rate in our part of it, who could have done such a thing. I used the harsher words about it, while I leaped upon our best horse, with bridle but no saddle, and set the heads of Kickums toward the course now pointed out to me. Who showed me the course, I cannot tell. I only know that I took it, and the men fell back before me. Weapon of no sort had I, unarmed, and wondering at my strange attire, with a bridal vest, wrought by our Annie, and red with the blood of the bride. I went forth just to find out this, whether in this world there be or be not God of justice. With my vicious horse at a furious speed, I came upon Blackmore Down, directed by some shout of men, which seemed to me but a whisper; and there, without a furlong before me, rode a man on a great black horse, and I knew that man was Carver Doone. "Your life or mine," I said to myself, "and as the will of God may be, but we two live not upon this earth one more hour together." I knew the strength of this great man, and I knew that he was armed with a gun, if he had time to load it again, after shooting my Lorna; or at any rate with pistols, and a horseman's sword as well. Nevertheless, I had no more doubt of killing the man before me than a cock has a spitting of a heartless fowl. Sometimes, seeing no ground beneath me, and sometimes heeding every leaf and the crossing of the grass blades, I followed over the long moor, reckless whether seen or not. But only once the other man turned around and looked back again, and then I was beside a rock with a reedy swamp behind me. Although he was so far before me, and riding as hard as he might, I saw that he had something on the horse in front of him, something which needed care, and stopped him from looking backwards. In the whirling of my wits, I fancied first that this was Lorna, until the scene I had been through fell across hot brain and heart, like the drop at the close of a tragedy. Rushing there through crag and crag, at utmost speed of a maddened horse, I saw, as of another's fate, calmly, as on canvas laid, the brutal deed, the piteous anguish, and the cold despair. The man turned up the gully leading from the moor to cloven rocks, through which John Fry had tracked Uncle Ben, as of old related; but as Carver entered it, he turned around, and beheld me not 100 yards behind, and I saw that he was bearing his child, little Ensie, before him. Ensie also descried me, and stretched his hand and cried to me, for the face of his father frightened him. Carver Doone, with a vile oath, thrust spurs into his flagging horse, and laid one hand on a pistol stock, whence I knew that his slung carbine had received no bullet since the one that had pierced Lorna, and a cry of triumph rose from the black depths of my heart. What cared I for pistols? I had no spurs, neither was my horse one to need the rowel. I rather held him in that urged him, for he was fresh as ever, and I knew that the black steed in front, if he had breasted the steep ascent where the track divided, must be in our reach at once. His rider knew this, and having no room in the rocky channel to turn and fire, drew rein in the crossway sharply, and plunged into the black ravine leading up to Wizard's Slough. "It is so," I said to myself, with a brain and a head cold as iron. "Though the foul fiend come from the slough to save thee, thou shalt carve it, Carver." I followed my enemy carefully, steadily, even leisurely, for I had him as in a pitfall, whence no escape might be. He thought that I feared to approach him, for he knew not where he was, and his low disdainful laugh came back. Laugh! He who wins, thought I. A gnarled and half-starved oak, as stubborn as my own resolve, and smitten by some storm of old, hung from the crag above me. Rising from my horse's back, although I had no stirrups, I caught a limb, and tore it, like a mere wheat awn, from the socket. Men show the rent even now, and wonder, none with more wonder than myself. Carver Doone turned the corner suddenly on the black and bottomless bog. With a start of fear he reined back his horse, and I thought he would have turned upon me; but instead of that, he again rode on, hoping to find a way around the side. Now there is a way between cliff and slough for those who know the ground thoroughly, or have time enough to search it; but for him there was no road, and he lost some time in seeking it. Upon this he made up his mind, and wheeling, fired, and then rode at me. His bullet struck me somewhere, but I took no heed of that, fearing only his escape. I laid my horse across the way, and with the limb of the oak struck full on the forehead his charging steed. Ere the slash of the sword came nigh me, man and horse rode over, and way nigh bore my own horse down with the power of their onset. Carver Doone was somewhat stunned, and could not arise for a moment. Meanwhile I leaped on the ground and waited, smoothing my hair back, and baring my arms, as though in the ring for wrestling. Then the little boy ran to me, clasped my leg, and looked up at me, and the terror in his eyes made me almost fear myself. "Ensie, dear," I said quite gently, grieving that he should see his wicked father killed, "run up yonder round the corner, and try to find a pretty bunch of bluebells for the lady." The child obeyed me. hanging back and looking back, and then laughing, while I prepared for business. There and then I might have killed my enemy with a single blow, while he lay unconscious, but it would have been foul play. With a sudden and back scowl, the carver gathered his mighty limbs and arose, and looked round for his weapons, but I had put them away well. Then he came to me and gazed, being wont to frighten thus young men. "Wouldn't have harmed you, lad," he said, with a lofty style of sneering. "I have punished you enough for most of your impertinence. For the rest I forgive you, because you have been good and gracious to my little son. Go and be contented." For answer I smote him on the cheek, lightly, not to hurt him, but to make his blood leap up. I would not sully my tongue by speaking to a man like this. There was a level of space of sward between us and the slough, with the courtesy derived from London, and the processions I had seen. To this place I led him, and that he might breathe himself, and have every fibre cool, and every muscle ready. My hold upon his coat I loosed, and left him to begin with me, whenever he brought proper. I think that he felt that his time was come. I think he knew from my knitted muscles, and the firm arch of my breast, and the way in which I stood, but most of all from my stern blue eyes, that he had found his master. At any rate, a paleness came, an ashy paleness on his cheeks, and the vast calves of his legs bowed in, as if he were out of training. Seeing this villain as he was, I offered him first chance. I stretched forth my left hand, as I do to a weaker antagonist, and I let him have the hug of me. But in this I was too generous, having forgotten my pistol wound, and the crackling of one of my shoulder low ribs. Carver Doone caught me round the waist, with such a grip as never yet had been laid upon me. I heard my rib go. I grasped his arm, and tore the muscle out of it. Note: a far more terrible clutch than this is handed down to weaker ages of the great John Ridd. As the string comes out of an orange, then I took him by the throat, which is not allowed in wrestling, but he had snatched at mine, and now was no time of dalliance. In vain he tugged, and strained, and writhed, dashed his bleeding fists into my face, and flung himself to me with gnashing jaws. Beneath the iron of my strength, for God that day was with me, I had him helpless in 2 minutes, and his fiery eyes lolled out. "I will not harm thee any more," I cried, so far as I could, for painting, the work being very furious. "Carver Doone, thou art beaten. Own it, and thank God for it, and go thy way, and repent thyself." It was all too late. Even if he had yielded to his ravaging frenzy, for his beard was like a mad dog's jowl, even if he would have owned that, for the first time in his life, he had found his master, it was all too late. The black bog had him by the feet. The sucking of the ground drew on him, like the thirsty lips of death. In our fury, we had heeded neither wet nor dry, nor thought of earth beneath us. I myself might scarcely leap, with the last spring of overlaboured eggs, from the engulfing grave of slime. He fell back, with his swollen breast, from which my grip had rent all clothing, like a hummock of bark oak, standing out the quagmire, and then he tossed his arms to heaven, and they were black to the elbow, and the glare of his eyes was ghastly. I could not gaze and pant, for my strength was no more than an infant's, from the fury and the horror. Scarcely could I turn away, while, joint by joint, he sank from sight. End of chapter 74. Recording by Daisy 55. Of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daisy 55. Lorna Doone by Aura D. Blackmore. Chapter 75. Life and Lorna Come Again. When the little boy came back with the bluebells, which he had managed to find, as children always do find flowers, when older eyes see none, the only sign of his father left was a dark brown bubble upon a newly formed patch of blackness. But to the centre of its pulpy gorge the greedy slough was heaving, and sullenly grinding its weltering jaws among the flags and the sedges. With pain and ache, both of mind and body, and shame at my own fury, I heavily mounted my horse again, and looked down at the innocent Ensie. Would this playful, loving child grow up like his cruel father, and end a godless life of hatred with a death of violence? He lifted his noble forehead towards me, as if to answer, "Nay, I will not." But the words he spoke were these: "Don," for he could never say John, "oh, Don, I am so glad that nasty, naughty manner's gone away. Take me home, Don, take me home." It has been said of the wicked, not even their own children love them. And I could easily believe that Carver Doone's cold-hearted ways had scared from him even his favourite child. No man would I call truly wicked, unless his heart be cold. It hurt me more than I can tell, even through all other grief, to take into my arms the child of the man just slain by me. The feeling was a foolish one, and a wrong one, as the thing has been, for I would fain have saved that man, after he was conquered. Nevertheless my arms went coldly round that little fellow, neither would they have gone at all, if there had been any help for it. But I could not leave him there, till some one else might fetch him, on account of the cruel slough, and the ravens which had come hovering over the dead horse. Neither could I, with my wound, tie him on my horse and walk. For now I had spent a great deal of blood, and was rather faint and weary. And it was lucky for me that the Kitchum had lost spirit, like his master, and went home as mildly as a lamb. For when he came towards the farm, I seemed to be riding in a dream almost, and the voices both of man and woman, who had hurried forth upon my track, as they met me, seemed to wander from a distant muffling cloud. Only the thought of Lorna's death, like a heavy knell, was tolling in the belfry of my brain. Then we came to the stable door. I rather fell from my horse than got off, and John Fry, with a look of wonder, took Kitchum's head, and led him in. Into the old farmhouse I tottered, like a weanling child, with mother in her common clothes, helping me along, yet fearing, except by stealth, to look at me. "I have killed him," was all I said, "even as he killed Lorna. Now let me see my wife, mother. She belongs to me none the less, though dead." "You cannot see her now, dear John," said Ruth Huckaback, coming forward, since no one else had the courage. "Annie is with her now, John." "What has that to do with it? Let me see my dead one, and pray myself to die." All the women fell away, and whispered, and looked at me, with side glances, and some sovereign, for my face was hard as flint. Ruth alone stood by me, and dropped her eyes and trembled. Then one little hand of hers stole into my great shaking palm, and the other was laid on my tattered coat. Yet with her clothes she shunned my blood, while she whispered gently, "John, She is not your dead one. She may even be your living one yet, your wife, your home, and your happiness. But you must not see her now. Is there any chance for her? For me? For me? I mean, God in heaven knows, dear John. But the sight of you, and in this sad plight, would be certain death to her. Now come first, and be healed yourself." I obeyed her like a child, whispering only as I went, for none but myself knew of her goodness. "Almighty God will bless you, darling, for the good you are doing now. Tenfold, and 1,000-fold. I prayed, and I believed it, when I came to know the truth. If it had not been for this little maid, Lorna must have died at once, as in my arms she lay for dead, from the dastard and murderous cruelty. But the moment I left her, Ruth came forward, and took the command of every one, in right of her firmness and readiness. She made them bear her home at once upon the door of the pulpit, with the cushion under the drooping head. With her own little hand she cut off, as tenderly as a pear is peeled, the bridal dress, so steeped and stained, and then with her dainty transparent fingers, no larger than a pencil, she probed the vile wound in the side, and fetched the reeking bullet forth, and then with the coldest water staunched the flowing of the life-blood. All this while my darling lay insensible, and as white as death, and needing nothing but her maiden shroud. But Ruth still sponged the poor side and forehead, and watched the long eyelashes flat upon the marble cheek, and laid her pure face on the faint heart, and bade them fetch her Spanish wine. Then she parted the pearly teeth, feebly clenched on the hovering breath, and poured in wine from a christening spoon, and raised the graceful neck and breast, and stroked the delicate throat, and waited, and then poured in a little more. Annie all the while looked on with horror and amazement, counting herself no second-rate nurse, and this as against all theory. But the quiet lifting of Ruth's hand, and one glance from her dark bright eyes, told Annie just to stand away, and not intercept the air so. And at the very moment when all the rest had settled that Ruth was a simple idiot, but could not harm the dead much, a little flutter in the throat, followed by a short, low sigh, made them pause, and look, and hope. For hours, however, and days, she lay at the very verge of death, kept alive by nothing but the care, the skill, the tenderness, and the perpetual watchfulness of Ruth. Luckily Annie was not there very often, so as to meddle, for kind and clever as she was, she must have done more harm than good. But my broken rib, which was set by a doctor, who chanced to be at the wedding, was allotted to Annie's care, and great inflammation ensuing, it was quite enough to content her. This doctor had pronounced poor Lorna dead, wherefore Ruth refused most firmly to have aught to do with him. She took the whole case on herself, and with God's help she bore it through. Now whether it were the light and brightness of my Lorna's nature, or the freedom from anxiety, for she knew not of my hurt, or, as some people said, her birthright among wounds and violence, of her manner of not drinking beer, I leave that doctor to determine who pronounced her dead. But anyhow, one thing is certain, sure as stars of hope above us, Lorna recovered, long ere I did. For the grief was on me still of having lost my love and lover at the moment she was mine. With the power of fate upon me, and the black cauldron of the wizard's death boiling in my heated brain, I had no faith in the tales they told. I believed that Lorna was in the churchyard, while these rogues were lying to me. For the strength of blood like mine, and power of heart behind it, a broken bone must burn itself. Mine went hard with fires of pain, being of such size and thickness, and I was ashamed of him for breaking by reason of a pistol ball, in the mere hug of a man, and it fetched me down in conceit of strength, so that I was careful of afterwards. All this was a lesson to me. All this made me very humble, illness being a thing, as yet, altogether unknown to me. Not that I cried small, or skulked, or feared the death which some foretold, shaking their heads about mortification and a green appearance; only that I seemed quite fit to go to heaven and Lorna. For in my sick distracted mind, stirred with many tossings, like the beard in the spear of frog spawn carried by the current, hung the black and central essence of my future life; a life without Lorna, a tadpole life, a stupid head, and nobody. Many men may like such life, anchorites, fakirs, high priests, and so on; but to my mind it is not the native thing God meant for us. My dearest mother was a show, with crying and with fretting. The Doones, as she thought, were born to destroy us. Scarce had she come to some liveliness, though sprinkled with tears every now and then, after her great bereavement, and 10 years' time to dwell on it, when lo, here was her husband's son, the pet child of her own good John, murdered like his father. Well, the ways of God were wonderful. So they were, and so they are, and so they ever will be. Let us debate them as we will, as ways are His, and much the same, only second hand from Him; and I expected something of Him, even in my worst of times, knowing that I had done my best. This is not edifying talk, as our nonconformist parson says, when he can get no more to drink. Therefore let me only tell what became of Lorna. One day I was sitting in my bedroom, for I could not get downstairs, and there was no one strong enough to carry me, even if I would have allowed it. Though it cost me some sore trouble and weariness, I had put all on my Sunday clothes, out of respect for the doctor, who was coming to bleed me again, as he always did twice a week. And it struck me that he had seemed hurt in his mind, because I wore my worst clothes to be bled in; for lie in bed I would not after 6 o'clock, and even that was great laziness. I looked at my right hand, whose gasp has been like that of a blacksmith's vice; and it seemed to myself impossible that this could be John Ridd's. The great frame of the hand was there, as well as the muscles, standing forth like the guttering of a candle, and the broad blue veins, going up the back and crossing every finger. But as for colour, even Lorna's could scarcely have been whiter; and as for strength, little Ensor Doone might have come and held it fast. I laughed as I tried in vain to lift the basin set for bleeding me. Then I thought of all the lovely things going on out of doors just now, concerning which the drowsy song of the bees came to me. These must be among the thyme, by the sound of their great content. Therefore the roses must be in bloom, and the woodbine, and clove gillyflower; the cherries on the wall must be turning red; the yellow sally must be on the brook; wheat must be callow with quivering bloom, and the early meadows side with hay. Yet here was I, a helpless creature, quite unfit to stir among them, gifted with no sight, no scent of all the changes that move our love, and leads our hearts, from mouth to mouth, along the quiet path of life. And what was worse, I had no hope of caring ever for them more. Presently a little knock sounded through my gloomy room, and supposing it to be the doctor, I tried to rise and make my bow. But to my surprise, it was little Ruth, who had never once come to visit me, since I was placed under the doctor's hands. Ruth was dressed so gaily, with rosettes and flowers and what not, that I was sorry for her bad manners, and thought she was come to conquer me, now that Lorna was done with. Ruth ran towards me with sparkling eyes, being rather short of sight. Then suddenly she stopped, and I saw entire amazement in her face. "Can you receive visitors, Cousin Ridd?" "Why, they never told me of this," she cried. "I knew that you were weak, dear John, but not that you were dying. Whatever is that basin for?" "I have no intention of dying, Ruth, and I like not to talk about it. But that basin, if you must know, is for the doctor's purpose." "What? Do you mean bleeding you? You poor weak cousin. Is it possible that he still does that?" "Twice a week for the last 3 weeks, dear. Nothing else has kept me alive." "Nothing else has killed you, nearly. There." And she set her little boot across the basin, and crushed it. "Not another drop shall they have from you." "Is Annie such a fool as that? And Lizzie, like a zany, at her books, and killing her brother between them?" I was surprised to see Ruth excited, her character being so calm and quiet, and I tried to soothe her with my feeble hand, as now she knelt before me. "Dear cousin, the doctor must know best, and he says so, every day. What has he been brought up for?" "Brought up for slaying and murdering. 20 doctors killed King Charles, in spite of all the women. Will you leave it to me, John? I have a little will of my own, and I am not afraid of doctors. Will you leave it to me, dear John? I have saved your Lorna's life, and now I will save yours, which is a far, far easier business." "You have saved Lorna's life? What do you mean by talking so?" "Oh, what I say, Cousin John, though perhaps I overprize my work. But at any rate, she says so." "I do not understand," I said, falling backward with bewilderment. "All women are such liars." "Have you ever known me to tell a lie?" Ruth, in great indignation, more feigned, I doubt, than "your mother may tell a story now and then when she feels it right, and so may both your sisters. But so you cannot do, John Ridd, and no more than you can I do it. If ever there was a virtuous truth in the eyes of a woman, it was now in Ruth Huckaback's, and my brain began very slowly to move, the heart being almost torpid from perpetual loss of blood. "I do not understand," was all I could say for a very long time. "Will you understand, if I show you Lorna? I have feared to do it, for the sake of you both. But now Lorna is well enough, if you think that you are, Cousin John, surely you will understand when you see your wife." Following her to the very utmost of my mind and heart, I felt that all she said was truth, and yet I could not make it out. And in her last few words there was such a power of sadness rising through the cover of gaiety, that I said to myself, half in a dream, "Ruth is very beautiful." Before I had time to listen much for the approach of footsteps, Ruth came back and behind her Lorna, coy as if of her bridegroom, and hanging back with her beauty. Ruth banged the door and ran away, and Lorna stood before me. But she did not stand for an instant. When she saw what I was like, at the risk of all thick bandages, and upsetting a dozen medicine bottles, and scattering leeches right and left, she managed to get into my arms, although they could not hold her. She laid her panting warm young breast on the place where they meant to bleed me, and she set my pale face up, and she would not look at me, having greater faith in kissing. I felt my life come back and warm. I felt my trust in a woman flow. I felt the joys of living now, and the power of doing it. It is not a moment to describe. Who feels can never tell of it. But the rush of Lorna tears, and the challenge of my bride's lips, and the throbbing of my wife's heart, now at last at home of mine, made me feel that the world was good, and not a thing to be weary of. Little more have I to tell. The doctor was turned out at once, and slowly came back my former strength, with my darling wife, and good victuals. As for Lorna, she never tired of sitting and watching me eat and eat. And such is her heart that she never tires of being with me here and there among the beautiful places, and talking with her arm around me, so far at least as it can go, though half of mine may go around her, of the many fears and troubles, dangers and discouragements, and worst of all the bitter partings, which we used to have, somehow. There is no need for my farming harder than becomes a man away. Lorna has great stores of money, though we never draw it out, except for some poor neighbour, unless I find her a sumptuous dress out of her own perquisite, and this she always looks upon as a wondrous gift for me, and kisses me much when she puts it on, and walks like the noble woman she is. And yet I may never behold it again, for she gets back to her simple clothes, and I love her the better in them. I believe that she gives half the grandeur away, and keeps the other half for the children. As for poor Tom Faggus, every one knows his bitter adventures, when his pardon was recalled, because of his journey to Exmoor. Not a child in the country, I doubt, but knows far more than I do of Tom's most desperate doings. The law had ruined him once, he said, and then he had been too much for the law; and now that a quiet life was his object, here the base thing came after him. And such was his dread of this evil spirit, that being caught upon Barnstaple bridge, with soldiers at either end of it, yet doubtful about approaching him, he set his strawberry mare, Sweet Winnie, at the left hand parapet, with a whisper into her dove-coloured ear. Without a moment's doubt she leaped it into the foaming tide, and swam, and landed according to orders. Also his flight from a public house, where a trap was set for him; but when he came, and broke down the door, and put 2 men under, and trod on them, is as well known as any ballad. It was reported for a while that poor Tom had been caught at last, by means of his fondness for liquor, and was hanged before Taunton jail. But luckily we knew better. With a good wife, and a wonderful horse, and all the county attached to him, he kept the law at a wholesome distance, until it became too much for its master, and a new king arose. Upon this Tom sued his pardon afresh, and Jeremy Stickles, who suited the times, was glad to help him in getting it, as well as a compensation. Thereafter the good and respectable Tom lived a godly, though not always sober, life, and brought up his children to honesty, as the first of all qualifications. My dear mother was as happy as possibly need be with us, having no cause for jealousy, as others arose around her, and everybody was well pleased when Lizzie came in one day and tossed her bookshelf over, and declared that she would have Captain Blockham, and nobody should prevent her; for that he alone, of all the men she had ever met with, knew good writing when he saw it, and could spell a word when told, as he had now succeeded to Captain Stickle's position, Stickles going up the tree, and had the power of collecting and of keeping what he liked. There was nothing to be said against it, and we hoped that he would pay her out. I sent little Ensie to Brundale School, at my own cost and charges; have changed his name, for fear of what any one might do to him. I called him Ensie Jones, and we got him a commission; and after many scruples of spirit, he did great things in the Low Counties. He looks upon me as his father, and without my leave will not lay claim to the heritage and title of the Doones, which clearly belong to him. Ruth Huckaback is not married yet, although upon Uncle Reuben's death she came into all his property, except, indeed, £2,000, which Uncle Ben, in his direst manner, bequeathed to Sir John Ridd, the worshipful knight, for greasing of the testator's boots; and he left almost a mint of money, not from the mine, but from the shop, and the good use of usury; for the mine had brought in just what it cost, when the vein of gold ended suddenly, leaving all concerned much older, and some, I fear, much poorer. But no one uttered ruin, as is the case with most of them. Ruth herself was his true mind, as upon deathbed he found. I know a man even worthy of her, and though she is not very young, he loves her, as I love Lorna. It is my firm conviction that in the end he will win her, and I do not mean to dance again, except at dear Ruth's wedding, if the floor be strong enough. Of Lorna, of my lifelong darling, of my more and more loved wife, I will not talk; for it is not seemly that a man should exalt his pride. Year by year her beauty grows, with the growth of goodness, kindness, and true happiness; above all with loving. For change she makes a joke of this, and plays with it, and laughs at it; and then, when my slow nature marvels, back she comes to the earnest thing. And if I wish to pay her out for something very dreadful, as may happen once or twice, when we become too gladsome, I bring her to forgotten sadness, and to me for cure of it, by the two words, Lorna Doone. End of chapter 75. Recording by Daisy 55. End of Lorna Doone, a romance of Exmoor, by Richard Doddridge Blackmore.